The Last Black Man in San Francisco is a 2019 independent drama directed by Joe Talbot in his directorial debut.
We built these ships, dredged these canals, in the San Francisco they never knew existed.
It stars Jimmy Fails as a character named Jimmy Fails, and it stars an array of character actors from Danny Glover to the mom in Everybody Hates Chris. In today's cinematic landscape, I generally find that the most provocative, earnestly soulful, and just thoughtfully poignant films come from the independent scene. Now that's not to say that there's obviously nothing like that coming from the major studios, coming from Hollywood, but it's important to acknowledge that we're not back in the 1970s when Hollywood mainstream would cross with genuinely challenging deconstructions of important socio-political topics and ideas the way that a film like The Last Black Man in San Francisco would.
We could throw parties. You could put on one of your plays. We could yell.
Where is this house?
Our old house.
That's not your old house and that's not your neighborhood.
Like I said, this is the work of a first-time director, Joe Talbot, but you wouldn't see that reflected in the film's craftsmanship. The cinematography is absolutely immaculate, and it's perfectly utilized to portray and characterize San Francisco depending on the mood that the director wants us to project onto it. At times, the city of San Francisco in this is a bleak one. It's soulless. It alienates our main characters because it seems to have left them and people who look like them behind in a world where the real estate market has antagonized people who do not fit in a homogeneous white society. And yet the cinematography can remind us of just how beautiful the city of San Francisco can be. There are so many gorgeous wide shots from the ocean. There are so many wide shots in this film that lend San Francisco this heavenly aura that clashes so strikingly with that soulless depiction that we're so often given through the eyes of our central character, Jimmy Fails. And obviously what Joe Talbot's trying to do is get at the heart of the dichotomy between gentrified San Francisco and culturally diverse San Francisco.
To leave is not your loss. It's San Francisco.
I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this. But I'm not leaving. I'm the last one left.
Our main character is Jimmy Fails. He's a young black man who is trying to reclaim a house that he grew up in but has since been sold to a upper-class white family. But the matriarch of that family has recently passed away, so the house is back on the market. So Jimmy goes in and he takes the house for himself once again. And he reclaims it by giving it that personality, that care that the previous family had neglected to give the house. But Jimmy's attempts to reclaim that house are challenged not only by a real estate developer who is trying to sell it off to the next white family that can afford it, but he's also scorned by his black peers who feel that he is selling out, that he's trying to be better than them by moving into this big house that has been previously occupied by a upper-class white family. The central issue is not just gentrification, but identity and how we associate material places with ourselves. Jimmy comes to define himself so heavily by that house that he can't stand the idea of losing it to another real estate developer. His best friend who's moved in with him is a writer, and he's constantly trying to remind Jimmy that his soul is more than the walls that surround him, that his soul extends beyond any wood, plaster, or concrete. But of course, from Jimmy's perspective, as we're reminded, this house is a manifestation of the culture that he has inherited but has since felt himself becoming alienated from by the barriers being set up by corporate America. Jimmy's a tragic character who's chasing something that will ultimately never satisfy him, because even if he can save this one house, that won't ultimately solve the issue of gentrification, and he's ultimately not going to save himself because he's obviously trying to compensate for some tragedies that he's suffered in his home life. He's alienated from his father, and his mother has practically abandoned him. Just on the level of aesthetics, again, The Last Black Man in San Francisco is to be celebrated, not only through its cinematography, but its beautiful, beautiful score that serves gospel renditions of popular songs from the 60s and 70s. And the cast is not to be neglected either. This is Jimmy Fails, well, the actor, not the character. Anyways, this is his first feature film, much like how this is Joe Talbot's feature film. They're actually friends who have done short films together in the past. And ultimately their companionship really shines through because while Jimmy Fails is not a professional actor, he is so in tune with this character and with this material that becomes an asset. He's such a vulnerable character. He wears his heart on his sleeve and he's chasing this optimistic, hopeful, romanticized version of what he thinks San Francisco should be. But again, he can't realize that won't ultimately fulfill him because he's restricting himself to a material thing and he's not allowing himself to connect with the people around him. He distances his best friend from him several times when his friend tries to make him realize that no, Jimmy doesn't have to define himself by that house. Not that his friend doesn't celebrate what Jimmy's trying to do and he doesn't respect it. He simply realizes that, again, Jimmy goes beyond walls. We as human beings can't define ourselves through material things. After all, San Francisco was not driven by material objects, it was driven by culture and by people. And that character, by the way, the playwright, probably has the standout performance of the movie. He's so passionate about his art, about being an artistic voice for the culture that he inherited, and the way that he chooses to celebrate that culture is very different than Jimmy's. There's so many great characters throughout the film, but there's a substantial group of supporting characters who are these black friends of theirs who hang out on this street corner, and they're supposed to represent a subsect of black culture that is driven more by masculinity and posturing. When Jimmy tries to reclaim that house for himself, he's not supported by them, he's scolded by them. They think he's trying to put himself on a pedestal and make it out like he's better than them. The closer Jimmy gets to his goal of reclaiming that house, the more he alienates people around him, both black and white. And I think that's ultimately what makes him such a tragic character. And I think that's ultimately what makes the ending of his film, the ending of his character arc, I don't want to spoil it for you guys if you haven't seen it, but I think you'll know what I mean when you do see it, that it is a powerfully sad note to end on. Since gentrification is a real socio-political issue that the film deals with, it's hard to talk about it without getting lost in the technicalities of the reality surrounding gentrification, which I obviously am not sophisticated enough to discuss, but from a filmgoer's perspective, I think this is just one of the most powerful statements that independent cinema has offered us in the past year at least. Please don't sit this one out, guys. I know I've reviewed this pretty late because I think it's already been out in theaters for maybe a week or two. So if you do have the chance to go see it, please do. Even if you are not a fan of movies that deal with, these socio-political issues, but the film grounds itself in such universal themes of identity, of culture, and about celebrating that culture versus being constricted by it, that I think it transcends those socio-political issues and it becomes a film about humanity. So please, if you're a film lover, I think this is for you, no matter what race you are.
I'm with you, brother.
Thanks for watching the review. If you have seen the film, please let me know what you think in the comments. Like if you want, subscribe if you want, and stay tuned for more content in the future.
If you're going